let's talk about customer data privacy and the role that that plays in customer experience. And I would love to get each of your perspective on what's going on with Apple and Facebook.
Well, I'll go ahead and start with a word that we often put together with empathy, and that's transparency. I think if you look at a lot of what Apple is talking about, if you look at what things like some of the regulations around GDPR and CCPA that have been all about consumer data privacy, core to all of them is this idea of transparency, that I as a consumer have a right to understand how my data is being used. I have a right to ask you not to use that data. And with AI, that feeds into this idea of explainability. If I'm using data to make decisions, I have to be able to explain how those decisions are being made. I have to be able to explain that from a purposes of doing things like ethical bias checking to make sure my algorithms aren't operating against some bias that I didn't even perhaps see. I have to do that for regulatory reasons, and hopefully I have to do that because as a brand, I feel like it's my responsibility to my clients to do. So I think one of the first things that we need to think about as we use data to drive better customer experiences, because I think done right, data can actually help us drive better experiences for customers, is to keep that idea of transparency first and foremost in how we use the data and how we explain the use of the data.
I think transparency and consent are two super interesting things for me. This nugget I picked up on the Facebook piece is that if you aren't paying, you are not the customer, right? And so you're actually the product in that sense. And so that's just an interesting way to think about it. But I do think the other part of this is consent, and that's going to change the way that we think about customer experience. Everybody's been talking about one-to-one personalization at scale for so long, and almost without regard for that sort of consent side of it. So what I think is really interesting is, like, I'm spending a lot of time right now thinking, what's like a salesperson and a buyer relationship going to look like in the future? And you kind of have to take all the cold stuff out of the equation completely. And I think that's really interesting. Even when you boil it down to those use cases where consent's a factor, privacy is a factor, it changes the way we all need to build. It changes the way the jobs are going to be playing out. So all that's super fascinating to me.
On the issue of privacy, this has been a topic that has been unregulated for far too long, right? And so when the regulation comes in, like GDPR and so on, companies scramble to keep up or to be just behind the regulation. What companies need to do is to be ahead of it. They have to know where their stance is, how do they value and see their customer data, what are their views on privacy. That's the first thing. The second thing I feel companies should do is they need to go that extra mile. They need to go the extra mile and anticipate things that regulation will come up with. I'll give you an example. You have third-party cookies on your websites. You can shut that down. It's within your prerogative to do that. You will forfeit something, but nonetheless, it is your choice. In the absence of the appropriate regulatory measures, one thing to look at is to look if there's a fundamental conflict in the business model and what the company does. So if the company's purpose is in generating, is in building advertising revenue, it is going to be at cross purposes with other things that they do. Clearly, that's the case with a company like Facebook. And so on that particular topic, as a consumer, I would certainly stand by the stance of Apple. Now, if the business is at cross purposes with what else it does, then there's a fundamental conflict. And many of the larger companies have that conflict. And so they're always going to be under suspicion. So you've got to keep your nose clean and keep your business separate from anything that gains you advantage by breaking privacy.
I love the idea of going beyond the regulation and what is right for the customer and taking those additional steps. I think it's important, and I think customer data is you have to treat it. It's so important, and it can help a company do so many things from a personalization standpoint, but it has to be done transparently and to build trust.
I think that sometimes we need to, this is going to seem weird, almost take a lead from the motion picture industry, right? And the reason the Motion Picture Rating Association existed is because the motion picture agents realized that either they need to figure out how to regulate themselves or the government was going to do it for them. And we did a survey towards the end of last year of private sector technology leaders, and 75% of them expected that AI usage, data usage would be government regulated in 3 years, which I find personally actually kind of depressing. I would love for the technology sector not to depend on the government to set down the laws, but for us as an industry to get to some agreement of what we think the right usage of data is and what is in the best interest of, how we can respect the privacy and the interest of our consumers and do that ourselves, so that we're not doing this because it's the law, but because it's actually the right thing to do.
In my view, what businesses have to do is make it so clear to people why the use of their data will actually improve their life. And, we have to find a way to help businesses do that without making it seem like it's a legal disclaimer statement where you're like, gosh, I'm not even sure what any of this says. And if people have the clarity on what you propose to do with the data and how it's going to make their experience better, then I don't have any data behind it, but I suspect people will opt in. If it's not clear to them, or if worse, they feel like it's going to be used to bombard them and to somehow impede their quality of life, then they won't opt in. So, I think empowering people to make informed choices is always inherently good for businesses to do.